Hello and welcome to my review and thoughts on SenLinYu's Alchemized. So my name is Zach, and on this channel I mostly review just science fiction and fantasy books, but I do read a little of everything else from comics to manga to business, personal development, and yes, once in a while I delve into romantasy or romantasy adjacent books. And this is a novel that I added to my Libby TBR list and got it on release day because I was just interested in the blurb on the back. I saw it on an upcoming most talked about books. It's dark fantasy with memory loss and necromancy, and being a fan of just fantasy in general, this sounded like, hey, I'll give it a shot. It's got a lot of buzz. It was on whatever article I was reading on Goodreads or New York Times about upcoming novels. And yes, it came on a release day, and talking to my classmate Patricia, so shout out to Patricia, that she was super excited for a Harry Potter fanfic, and we realized we were talking about the exact same book. And I had no idea this originally started its life as Manacled, a Hermione Harry Potter fanfic between Draco and Hermione. Totally new territory for me, and someone who hasn't even read the Harry Potter books. I watched the movies, of course, so I was familiar with the world. And as I started this, it took a while to get used to the world of Alchemized by SenLinYu. So the quick recap, and I'm sure you already know if you're familiar with this. If not, because you're just a general fantasy reader like me, Alchemized started as Manacled by SenLinYu, which is a fanfic of an alternate telling of Harry Potter where Hermione and Draco, the two characters from the books and movies, get together, and it's told in a described the original Manacled as a memory loss. I don't want to spoil too much, but I think people know about this by now, but it's memory loss, a bit of Handmaid's Tale, and a couple different elements kind of all wrapped together in this definitely romantasy adjacent story. And so Alchemized came as a result of the author SenLinYu getting a traditional publishing deal, and they changed the novel to be kind of Harry Potter with the serial numbers filed off. So it's definitely has echoes of the Harry Potter world, but it's not explicitly Harry Potter. In the original fanfic, Hermione was named Hermione, I believe, but in this novel, the main character is Helena, and she's sort of like Hermione. You can obviously see that she's inspired by Hermione. The male main character is not really Draco Malfoy. It is Kane, who's definitely blonde-haired, like son of a aristocratic family in the same world. So it definitely felt like Harry Potter when I read it. And just getting to my thoughts on it, that's what I struggled with at first in the part 1 section. And what I really loved was part 2, and part 3, which I just finished earlier today, was still good. But I spent most of part 1 in my mind trying to equate, is this character this in Harry Potter? Is Helena is Hermione, right? Draco is Kane, right? Luke is Harry, because it's the character Luke is the leader of the resistance, and it's definitely seems like it could be Harry, but it's not explicitly said it's Harry. But as it went on, it was clear in part 2 that yes, Luke Holdfast is Harry Potter. He's the leader of the resistance, the prince of the dynasty, but everything's changed ever so slightly, so it's definitely not exactly one-on-one Manacled, even though yes, never read Manacled. But I saw it more as yes, this alternate world Harry Potter where it's there if you look, it has the echoes of Harry Potter, and that allowed, I think, the author to, like fanfiction does, really play in the world without going into the backstory and in depth of what everything means, the history of Palladia, which is England, that it's not really as expositional as other traditional fantasy I read, even though yes, it was a super long book, so they definitely went into details, but it was more on the character development between the two characters and the people surrounding them. And that said, I enjoyed the writing. It is definitely a well-written book. They are a great author, SenLinYu. I think, they're a great author. It was really well written. It kept me engaged, even though I'm not a fantasy reader. So those fantasy scenes, and there are a couple steamy kind of sex scenes that don't get too explicit, but it's definitely, they're definitely doing stuff in the novel, but it's very brief. So even myself, not that I'm prude and turned off by the scenes like that, because it does happen in other fantasy novels I've read. It's not something shocking to read. It's just not what I was going into the novel looking for. And I'm sure, yes, this novel has an audience for that. They're looking for a little fantasy with their romance. And for myself, I am looking for fantasy first and romance second. So I enjoyed the world building 100%. I think they did a great job, SenLinYu, in creating the world. It felt very lived in, and again, it had the echoes of Harry Potter. So I felt like it was the wizarding world. The way the characters moved in the world, I guess you could say, was familiar, but definitely totally different. The magic system, which took a while in my mind to get used to what they were even talking about, that magic is resonance. So every time they said resonance, it took me a couple chapters for realize, yes, they're talking about magic and the necromancy. And again, as someone who hasn't read the books, is that really what like the Death Eaters use in Harry Potter? I don't think it was that explicit, but the whole reanimating the dead and working with the dead is definitely a main feature of the Voldemort character, the evil one, the dark high necromancer in Alchemized. He uses necromancy, whereas I don't think in Harry Potter, again, not reading the books, they were really doing necromancy and reanimating the dead to be servants. So some very cool world building, and I like that dark world. It felt, I guess, almost like a Star Wars, where it's the rebellion fighting back. So the Order of the Phoenix, who in this novel is the Eternal Flame. Again, that was a little bit maybe on the nose of Eternal Flame and Order of the Phoenix. I made that connection in my head, that the Eternal Flame is more like a rebel group, like the Rebel Fighters in Star Wars. That's where my mind went. And they're fighting back against the Empire, which is the High Necromancer or Voldemort's empire, who won at this point. So in this part of this alternate Harry Potter world, Voldemort won the Wizarding War, and the rebels led by Prince Harry and the Order of the Phoenix are fighting back against Voldemort's troops, and it's very more militaristic fighting back. They go to the front lines and they talk about this. So if you like military fantasy, this is definitely up your alley. It's a very military fantasy novel. And to get back to part one is very interesting because we're dropped in this world, and me not having read Manacled, I didn't know the context of what's going to happen later. So Hermione, Helena's character, is dealing with memory loss, while Draco/Kane's character is trying to extract her memories with his psychic magic, and he's going into her mind. And so it's a lot of like mind games, and that was very interesting from a magic, just a general fantasy standpoint, where she's trying to figure out what she lost. Was it on purpose? So you have the unreliable narrator, which is a common plot device in a lot of fantasy novels, where the character retelling the story doesn't really know at this point what's real, what's not, and we know that she's lost her memories or something's happened to her, so she's influenced by what's happening, which of course does get resolved at the end. We find out why, and that is part two, which part two I love. Part one is a little, the writing kept me engaged and interested, and I kept reading, but part two is where I was really sold on the story, and part two was very long, I felt, and I almost forgot what we were getting at in part one by the time part two was over. So part two details 4 years prior to the events of part one, where the characters are waging their war against Voldemort, this rebellion war. Hermione's really, a healer in this, but she wants to be on the front line, and she is helping out by assisting in her role. So if you can imagine Harry Potter, that she's like the assistant to Harry in the novel. So she's helping Luke in the battle in her medic qualities, because that's her magic system is of a medical nature. So she's using her vivimancy healing powers to aid the troops. And it's very, this war-torn, gritty. They're scraping by the rebels to fight back against the evil empire. And let me check my notes. That was my favorite parts of the story. Just the world. It felt very lived in. The descriptions that they use, that SenLinYu uses, it felt like I was there on the front lines with them. And the big plot of the story is this enemies to lovers, which is what we learn and develop in part 2. And this is kind of not a spoiler, but not really. I think everyone knows that's the point of Hermione, is that the two rivals, Draco and Hermione, are eventually become lovers. And that's what we see develop in part 2, what led to the events of part 1. And then as we get to part 3, we see the kind of dramatic events that happened towards the end of part 1. I really, again, liked part 2. I thought it was very interesting. The different arcs, I guess you could say, like the Rescue Harry arc, where Luke/Harry gets captured and a group of them kind of splinter off from the main forces and have to rescue Luke through this, where he's being held. Very interesting world. Seeing this, again, echoes of Harry Potter and the wizarding world, and kind of understanding what the world entails, who the characters are, the different hierarchies, but with a different lens and this more militaristic Order of the Phoenix / Eternal Flame, and how it's morphed into a religious order built around Harry/Luke as a religious like savior figure. So it's a very interesting and different take on the Harry Potter universe, and I appreciate that from just a creative writing standpoint for how this world came together, where it's the same but different, and it feels like Harry Potter, but it's not Harry Potter, but it definitely is Harry Potter. So that all is what worked for me. Again, what didn't work, I guess you'd say, is some of the romance. Yes, I felt it was maybe a little too explicit for what I read, because again, I was going into this looking forward to just a dark fantasy, as the back described, not necessarily romantasy. I know as I was discussing this with my classmate Patricia, who is loving the book and she's loving the fantasy and romantasy elements of this is definitely a different audience for that. If you're looking for romantasy, I know this is right up your alley. This is going to be a 100% win for any fan of Hermione. You're going to love the writing because it's similar but different. It definitely has all the elements of an enemies to lovers stories. It has some kind of heartbreak moments that, again, I'm talking this through Patricia, who had read Manacled and is a big fan of Manacled. The parts that hit her in part 1 didn't really affect me in part 1, because I guess I didn't understand the dynamics of the characters as I was reading in part 1. So I don't know if that's an effect of the writing, but it didn't really have an emotional impact on me in part 1 because I didn't understand what was happening due to the later implications that are going to happen in part 2 and part 3. So it didn't hit as emotionally, or again, maybe just a callous reader who is looking for the fantasy elements. And I was more lost in the world and learning about the world building, the magic systems, and just the whole war that's going on, which I thought was more interesting. This, what if Voldemort won? What if the bad guys won? And how would the resistance fight back? How would that change the wizarding world of Harry Potter? So I thought it was a very interesting fan fiction kind of story of that, of what if Voldemort won, and along the way Hermione and Draco become enemies to lovers, and we delve into all that. So it's very interesting. I like the chimeras, I like the magic. The magic has echoes of Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson, and the novel The Final Empire is actually also a novel of what if the bad guy won. So not sure if SenLinYu had some inspiration there, but the magic system is metal based in the Mistborn saga, and here in Alchemized, one of the flavors of magic that's changed a bit is it's elemental based on magic, and there's this alchemy and metallurgy where they can change the metal elements, and it's used to great effect, not to spoil too much, with certain guerrilla warfare tactics, I guess you could say, by both sides. So some very interesting things with the metal, and that's where the name Manacled comes from. One of the metals blocks magic powers. I guess this is from the original book, but manacles, they make these anti-magic manacles based on a specific element, and that's what nullifies the magic / resonance in the wear of the chains. Also, you could think of it as a One Piece reference. If you're a One Piece manga fan, it's like the sea stone that stops the devil fruit powers in the One Piece series. But anyways, very interesting that I like them. Again, necromancy, but alchemy, quasi the religious resistance. So that was the different thing. Look at my notes. That Order of the Phoenix is more religious, and it felt very military / religious based with the hierarchy. And there's, I don't think this is in regular Harry Potter, but this legend of Orion and kind of the founder of the Order of the Phoenix or the Eternal Flame. So it adds a different dimension to how the Eternal Flame came about with this sort of creation myth. And I thought it was very interesting world building. And the world itself was created, there's some vague references to like a cataclysmic event that started the world. So I'm not sure. I think this is just straight new material, not in the Harry Potter world, but it's an interesting kind of creation myth added to the world of Alchemized to make it its own world and not just Harry Potter adjacent. It's the hidden magical world, but it's very interesting how this may have came apart and become its own kind of universe and how magic came to this world at least. And in closing, part 3, I think it tied everything together almost too neatly. So after a rather traumatic, a very overtly sexualized couple scenes in part 1, and then part 2, which had some great military fantasy action, which again, my favorite part, to show the events of how we got to part 1 by going back to the past in part 2. But then part 3, once I got to part 3, it reset to, okay, once I remembered finally where I was at the end of part 1 and what was going on with the memory loss and where we were. And I felt it did wrap up nicely and maybe almost too nicely. So they beat Voldemort. Voldemort is, ruined by some of the events that happened in part 2. He's weakened and we eventually fight back and everyone lives happily ever after. Again, that's maybe not a spoiler because it's not everyone gets a happy ending and there are definitely some things that happen to the characters, but it's a very hopeful, I guess you could say, not happily ever after, but it's a very hopeful ending, kind of akin to the Harry Potter movies where we see we do another time skip towards the very end where we get 4 years later and then 10 years later to see kind of what happens in the future in this point with the characters and how everything that happened in the novel at the end of Alchemized and then what it looks like in the future and how the world has already changed. So it's similar to the end, at least of the Harry Potter movies, where we see the kids and Harry's grown up with kids at the end of Harry Potter. But in this novel, we see, yes, 14 years later, 4 plus 10, what's happened to Helena and Draco/Kane and everything that's in the events of the novel and where all of the characters, the new characters, the old characters are years later. And it ends, as a chatting with Patricia who knows Manacled, it ends on a similar beat as Manacled. So it has a still ending that's history is written by the victor, which I thought was a great theme actually. So to speak back to positive stuff, one of the themes that's mentioned and sprinkled earlier in the novel as the narrative of the winner. So when Luke does something, the Order of the Phoenix wants to control the narrative, or Eternal Flame wants to control the narrative for how the events are spun to the public, because they're also kind of waging a PR war, not PR war, but just public relations in general for the narrative, for how their forces are. So that's brought up when the Eternal Flame is low on forces. They want to project that they have strength and how that's going to play in the media. Or when Luke does something, they spin the story another way. So that's an interesting theme I thought was well done and explored in the novel that SenLinYu writes about, that history is written in the victor. And we see that echoed again at the very end when they were given the line of, and she did not fight. And it puts into context of that theme we've seen throughout, that it's really written by the victor and how we may not know the whole story. And we're shown that in the novel of things we're shown and read about history in general, and especially in the world of Harry Potter, that this all could be true because the world of Harry Potter was written by the victor. So what if this is actually the real story of Harry Potter and stuff that we didn't see as, again, written by the ending, by the victor. So that was an interesting theme. It definitely has a lot of also, I don't want to boil it down to women empowerment, but women not empowered, but put down by society. So Helena's character is definitely marginalized in this novel as both a woman and as someone from the outcast. So it's repeatedly shown also that the Holdfast or the Potters are doing kind of a charity case by bringing an outsider from a different country into the Eternal Flames ranks, that she's a sponsored student, so she's fighting against the odds to make a name for herself. So that's dealt with in a, I thought, again, as just a general male reader who reads mostly male power fantasy novels where, yes, it's swords and sorcery kind of things. I thought it was a very well done character study of the role of women and how they are marginalized, and how Hermione/Helena's character is marginalized in this because she's both an outsider to the world and a woman in general, and how the characters treat women in the novel because she's a woman, that, oh, she can't possibly fight on the front lines, and her role is to be a healer, where she shows her strength because she wants to fight, she wants to help Luke and do anything for the Eternal Flame, because she has this, I think, just a religious adherence or reverence, I guess is the word I'm looking for the Eternal Flame's mission, and to destroy necromancy and destroy the High Necromancer. And then we see that mirrored, interestingly, in with the Kane/Draco character, who has a very similar, of course, maybe cliche, but a very similar ideology, but warped to a different way, where he'll do anything to save his one person, and he has a almost religious devotion to Hermione/Helena. So that was an interesting way that SenLinYu wrote the two characters to be so similar, and we find out in the backflash 4 years prior, how they're actually very similar to each other, and that's what, of course, draws them together, because even though they're both on different sides of the war and on different social status, him being from a high family, and then through the events, he becomes part of Voldemort's army, but then her being the outsider, and they come together as the two outcasts, but with similar ideological, I guess you could say, upbringings and how they view the world, and then how Helena directs that towards the Eternal Flame, and Draco directs that towards Helena eventually, so that enemies to lovers. And I did like the character interaction of Draco and his kind of reasoning, and it has that kind of twisted villain way where, yes, he does a lot of horrible things throughout the novel, but you can understand why he did it, and it made clear through the novel of his intentions and his rationale. But okay, maybe the methods, obviously killing people everywhere, is maybe not the right way, but he did it for the right reasons. It almost has like a Thanos from the Marvel universe, that he just wants balance. He's that sympathetic villain Draco is / Kane is in this novel. So I did like Kane's character. I liked Helena's character. I thought she was a well-written character in this, that she seemed more than just Hermione. She's her own character in this novel. So both the two main characters were very positive for me. The military fantasy was very positive. The world building. The only negative, again, would be the romance sections, which was not my cup of tea. I didn't really care too much about it, but on the positive side, it wasn't that overpowering. I think this is toned down a bit from steamy romance, like a romantasy first novel. This is more, I guess, middle of the road. It's definitely romance as a plot point, as a main selling point, how the characters develop this, but it has enough elements that it may be worth giving a shot to if you like military with a little bit of romance, it's a decent amount of romance. So it is the good writing. I like SenLinYu's writing. They are a great writer. I think it's very interesting prose and world building. And what I would recommend for a similar novel, so if this is your first fantasy novel, if you do traditionally read more romantasy, you may like other novels that I've recently read and reviewed in this channel. Catabasis by R.F. Kuang, I would say, comes to mind because that's also a enemies to lovers story set in a dark world. It's set in hell, where the two academics go into hell. So it has this very similar dark academia vibe, going into hell and enemies to lovers, but definitely a different writing style and a little more low magic than this novel would be. And if you want to switch the other way that I referenced earlier, I think Mistborn or The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson could be a good shot, because it has very similar what if the bad guy won, and here's a magic system based on metals, and it's a little little more not as deep and dark fantasy as some other traditional fantasy I read usually. So it is a good beginner fantasy, I guess you could say. So I would recommend Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson or Catabasis by R.F. Kuang would be pretty good, interesting starts. And then, though I haven't read it myself, I read other R.F. Kuang novels. Her series, The Poppy War, is more military fantasy. So I think that could be a interesting, similar novel by a similar writing style with a romance subplot and military fantasy, but not as pure military fantasy as other novels that I'm loving, like Malazan, Book of the Fallen, which is definitely on the epic fantasy scale and with very zero romance, but very cool world building. So I am big to recommend that. And I think also what I'm currently reading, if you want something totally different and something weird, I'm reading Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe, and it has a different psychological, interesting kind of savior character who is maybe similar to a Harry Potter Luke Holdfastness. So it's definitely not for everyone, but it could be worth checking out if you like really interesting and weird world building. That's my current obsession in the fantasy world with interesting world building is Book of the New Sun, and then Malazan, Book of the Fallen, which is epic fantasy with really interesting military world building. So those are all my thoughts and my impression as a non-Harry Potter, non-Manacled reader, mostly fantasy and sci-fi reader. But I gave Alchemized by SenLinYu a shot, read it in under a week, started on when it came out and finished it in about 5-6 days. So if that tells you anything, I thought it was a really easy read, a fun read. It kept me engaged. I wanted to see what happened next and to figure out is Draco and Hermione, are they going to get together? Of course they're going to get together, but how do they get together? Because we see the flashback the 4 years later and the 4 years earlier and what's going to happen. How are they going to defeat Voldemort? And some really cool fantasy, military fantasy, very dark world. You've read it already, but yes, content warnings. There is a lot of gore and violence, which was surprising and a positive for me because I wasn't expecting that. But if you're a light intro to fantasy reader, this is a very dark and gritty world with a lot of mature themes that happen in the book. But hey, that might be exactly what you're looking for, or check out the books I recommended earlier. Thanks for watching this thoughts and ramblings because it is a lot to talk about. It's a lot to think about. It was a long novel. Thanks for watching and have a great day.